Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast. The following conversation originally appeared in episode 111 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. And for our panel today, we'll be discussing being an atheist writer. And I'm joined by two guest geeks. So first up, we've got Tobias Buckell, making his sixth appearance on the show. He's the author of the Xenowealth series of space adventure novels, and the New York Times bestselling Halo novel The Cole Protocol. His latest book is Hurricane Fever, a sequel to his 2012 eco-thriller Arctic Rising. So Toby, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And also joining us today is James Morrow. The Washington Post calls him the most provocative satiric voice in science fiction, and the Denver Post has hailed him as Christianity's Salman Rushdie, only funnier and more sacrilegious. His books include Towing Jehovah, Only Begotten Daughter, and Bible Stories for Adults, and his latest book is called The Madonna and the Starship. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be here among fellow geeks.
All right, and so the current year is 2014, which means that exactly 15 years ago this summer, Toby and I were students at the Clarion Writers Workshop, and Jim was our week one instructor. And so Jim, I don't know if you know this, but actually the main reason I wanted to go to Clarion that summer was because I had been reading your books and I saw that you were going to be there and I wanted to meet you.
Well, that's very gratifying.
And so obviously that ended up being a big decision in my life. For example, if I hadn't gone that summer, I wouldn't have met Toby, and then Geek's Guide to the Galaxy would have been immeasurably impoverished. So I just really want to thank you, Jim, first of all, for just being so awesome that it motivated me to go to Clarion that summer.
Well, you're very welcome. For you, awesomeness will be my default.
And so, Jim, I know it was 15 years ago, but do you have any recollections from that week? Do you remember what Toby and I were like as fresh-faced college kids?
I think I had you fingered for a couple of young writers who had a future in this business. Now, you were with, this maybe sounds gratuitous, but I really, you were among the handful where I said to myself, they've got it. They're gonna make it.
All right, cool. Toby, do you have any recollections of Jim or me from 15 years ago?
15 years ago, it's kind of wild to think that it's been a decade and a half and that we're still plugging away in the field. That's it doesn't seem like that long ago, does it?
No.
It just, it seems like yesterday I showed up in a half rusted out, broken down Cavalier and with $5 in my ashtray and no idea how I was going to even eat.
I wish I'd known that. I would have brought food to the workshop.
Oh, they were really cool. I got a scholarship, but I literally showed up with $5 in an ashtray because I'd paid everything to get there and showed up and was 20 years old and a junior in college and just had no idea what was going to happen next. But I was really excited to be there.
I guess it paid off. I can't say for sure that I predicted you'd become a New York Times best-selling author, but I'm not surprised.
And actually, if people want to listen to the episode where we interviewed Werner Vinci, I don't remember what episode it was now, but Toby came on after that, and he tells the whole story, and it's a great story. And so if you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend going and checking it out. There's actually a lot of really good Toby stories in that episode. But all right, let's jump into our panel topic for today, which is being an atheist writer. So Jim, why don't you just start out and tell us just sort of what was your religious upbringing and how did you become an atheist?
Well, when I was a kid, growing up in the Philadelphia suburbs, my parents took me to kind of white person's Presbyterian church in the town of Willow Grove. I think Mom and Dad had a kind of vaccination theory of religion, inoculate the kid with a little bit of the stuff, and then he'll be immune to zealotry. He won't come home one day and announce that he's decided to join a monastery. When you're a white bread Philadelphia suburban Presbyterian, there's really not much to lapse from people sometimes assume that my writing project is about recovering from having been assaulted by a nun with a ruler or something like that. But that said, I did have a kind of road to Damascus experience in which my sort of bland theism disappeared, not overnight, but it was a function of encountering world literature. I had this amazing 10th grade world literature class at Abington High School, taught by the amazing James Giordano. And we read the great skeptics. We read novelists and poets for whom received wisdom was by definition insufficient. We read Camus' The Stranger and Voltaire's Candide. We read Kafka's The Trial, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, books by, if not atheists, certainly honest doubters, anguished skeptics. And those books just spoke to me. So I call it my inverse road to Damascus. This sounds a little bit mystical, but it's not really. It just, the voice of Voltaire telling me to cross-examine received wisdom is a voice I've never gotten out of my head.
Maybe it was like the road from Damascus. It's like a two-way road.
That would be a better way to put it. So, I haven't looked back. The skeptical, atheist, scientific, humanist way of being in the world continues to enrich every moment of my day. And it'd be hard for me to imagine abandoning it, but maybe God has other plans for me.
And how about Toby? What was your religious upbringing like?
My religious upbringing was primarily Anglican. I grew up in Grenada, which is formerly, English territory, and became its own country in 1979, right when I was born, in fact. And the Anglican Church there is still very strong. And for those of you who are not of the Commonwealth, if you're American, that would be Episcopalian. And that's sort of, very similar in some ways to Catholic upbringing, which is in terms of the theology being, Old Testament is a fable, which was sort of the best that the desert tribes could do at the time, and then the New Testament is the stuff that was really, really believed. And my educational upbringing was very European in terms of being taught, evolution, and in particular, we had something that I don't see many of my friends in the States experiencing, which was that I took a class on religion, which featured all the different religions when I was in school. And that was interesting to me because we did take biblical literature while I was in public school, or the British equivalent of public school. And that was kind of fantastic. My own personal journey, though, was more influenced by the fact that I started reading books around 6 or 7 years old, just whole novels. I just started consuming them. And, what I started consuming was just anything I could get my hands on, which included the Bible. And it left me with a lot of questions that adults did not like to answer. And, sort of getting shut down and yelled at by people for kind of asking questions about behavior or things that people said that it didn't. Things like that just start to add up. As well as the fact that I got into loving science fiction fairly early, which exposed me to a broad range of perspectives. So I still remember one of the first novels I read was Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, and one of the main conceits in it is that a race of aliens that looks like demons comes to Earth, and they hide themselves for a long time because it turns out that all of our mythology about demons comes from a botched first encounter back in prehistory. And between that and between reading a lot of other mythology, I was reading Greek and Norse mythology a lot as a kid because it fascinated me. And that led me into just picking up any book on mythology that I encountered. Anything I could find fascinated me. And if you read enough books in mythology, you start to just sort of, at one point, the question just kind of pops into your head, even as a young kid, like, well, at some point, everyone believed this was true in their perspective and their unique point in time. What if the particular religion that's all around me is that fable and myth as well? Because certainly it has a lot of the same literary tricks, a lot of the same methods, and it's very similar. And I started to read a lot of biblical literature and scholarly research, and wherever I could find it, and came away from that just sort of eventually just sliding all the way into general atheism.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and Toby, I mean, you talk about how science fiction in particular kind of inclines you toward atheism. And that was, I mean, I was not raised religious, so I've always been an atheist. And just as a kid, I think I was drawn to science fiction because it just seemed like this little corner of sanity in American pop culture. Authors like Isaac Asimov and Douglas Adams were very outspokenly atheistic. I don't know, Jim, what do you think about that? Did you did you read science fiction growing up, and did you associate it with atheism when you started getting into it?
I wasn't a fan exactly, so my trajectory into the genre was not typical. But I certainly read some canonical works, especially H.G. Wells, whose religious views were skeptical, I would say, to say the least. And certainly following Wells for many generations, atheism was the default mode of science fiction, I would say, which makes sense. I mean, science is, after all, concerned exclusively with the material universe. It's concerned with a realm in which there are no gods, so it would tend to attract people for whom the cosmos is sufficient. That's kind of a weird remark I just made. The cosmos is sufficient. Well, I should hope so. But yes, Asimov was famously atheistic. With Arthur Clarke, who I also read as a young reader, we have somebody who's a religious skeptic, but a writer who's finding a kind of transcendence or numinosity through his SF thought experiments. But I think that's another reason to argue that science fiction is a good place for atheists, because the world picture painted by science, it seems to me, is far more beautiful and awe-inspiring than pretty much anything we find in Scripture or Revelation, with maybe the possible exception of the book of Job and a couple of pieces of Revelation. To be sure, there have been conspicuous believers dipping into the genre all along. C.S. Lewis, arguably Ray Bradbury, certainly Orson Scott Card, and Gene Wolfe, and Michael Bishop, and Tim Powers. But I would imagine that Toby's story and your story are typical, where we haven't yet had any encounter to persuade us that the world is being supervised by an omnibenevolent, omnicompetent, omniscient deity.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, actually, the last time we discussed, back when I interviewed Richard Dawkins, we did a panel on atheism and science fiction. And I talked about a panel I had seen years ago about the subject of sort of atheism and religion and science fiction. And Jim, you were actually on that panel. And you said something that's stuck with me all these years, is people were talking about consensus reality. Mm-hmm. Just sort of this idea that everybody, that sane people generally all agree on what reality is. And you said, I don't think we live in a world with consensus reality. I think we live in this consensus fantasy where, everybody, just sane, average people that you meet, just by default, just believe things that have no empirical support for them whatsoever.
I wish I could say I remember that. This was a panel, a science fiction panel?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what convention it was at. It might have been at one of the World Cons. Jim McDonald was also on the panel.
Well, I do like that term, consensus fantasy. I think I will start to recycle it. Yeah, I admire Dawkins, and I think maybe I especially love him for the enemies he makes. I mean, this new atheism, not only Dawkins, of course, but Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, it's just gotten everybody bent out of shape. And I think of Dawkins as rather like the little boy who notices that the emperor is naked in Hans Christian Andersen's fable. And Dawkins' critics, they seem to be saying, well, that little boy, he's pretty ugly, and he's kind of pockmarked, and I don't think his parents ever got married. And, meanwhile, we've got the little boy, or we've got Dawkins saying, but the emperor's naked. The emperor's naked. Yeah. And besides, say the critics, but the emperor isn't really naked. I mean, there's this kind of pocket of oxygen around him, right? and he's a pretty hairy emperor now, that when it comes down to it. So, that seems to be the idiom in which we're addressing these terribly annoying uppity atheists. And sure, there's a critique one can make. Maybe what they're tilting with is a caricature of belief rather than the lived experience of churchgoers. But they've certainly created a kind of dialectic that I find to be very healthy and long overdue.
Mm-hmm. Actually, Toby, Jim mentioned Orson Scott Card. And one thing I really wanted to ask you about was shortly after we were at Clarion, actually, back in 2002, Orson Scott Card reviewed Philip Pullman's Dark Materials trilogy. And I don't know if you remember this, and you wrote a response to it that at the time just struck me as being very, very brave and just really well done. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember this at all?
I wish I could remember it. Thank you very much. I'm flattered, but no, I don't remember it at all.
Okay.
I really like the Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy, because it was, one of the things I enjoy about science fiction is the sort of freedom to sort of try these experiments and these thought experiments. And it was a genre I felt that opened to many different kinds of things. And so, I just I'm really glad that it was a genre that I found a welcoming and sort of a open space for ideas. So I do tend to occasionally, try to stand up for work that I think was doing something interesting.
Mm-hmm. I guess, sort of what in this article Orson Scott Card had written, he had mentioned in passing that Hitler was an atheist.
Oh gosh, yes, that argument.
And you wrote this post responding to it. I mean, really just completely demolishing it. But what really struck me was
good for you, Toby.
But yeah, he had all sorts of links and stuff. I mean, it was really impressive. I actually just went back and reread it last night. But what really struck me, Toby, that I want to talk to you about is just how, like, what's it like, sort of coming out as an atheist and being, like responding to such a well-known author and stuff as a 22-year-old, newcomer.
I think probably now would be more of a grenade than it was back then. I don't think as many people were paying attention to me. So it probably was safer at 22 to mount a strong defense than it is now. I'd probably get a lot more angry email and clicks and so forth and so on. But I mean, even then, there was you get a lot of flack. I don't really talk that often about being an atheist in science fiction or an atheist as a writer, but I mean, obviously I am, an atheist and not religious. And so like you mention and you put out stuff every once in a while when you see something that you think is fairly ridiculous in terms of its dogma. And you do get kind of this pushback where people were like, oh, but you're a nice guy. You can't be an atheist. Why are you saying these horrible things? And you get this, you find that people have a lot of baggage that they bring to stuff that, in terms of how they interact with you and their hopes and their dreams, because most people, they read something or they follow you and they want you to be just kind of like them, and it makes them sort of a little discomfited when you are not, and so there are, traditionally, since America is, and most of my audience is American right now, since America is primarily a more religious nation, a lot of my readers are, of course, religious. And so some of them who are not aware of the fact that I'm non-religious will come across the fact for the first time and get sort of a little bit upset and try to engage, with a set of arguments or assumptions that they have that you may have already considered. And one of the big, my problem with Orson Scott Card isn't that he's super religious. It's that he makes a lot of horrible, horrible arguments and trots out a lot of really worn out sort of themes or old arguments. And one of those is like Hitler is an atheist, therefore, that shows that atheism is bad and it'll lead to bad things. And it's just a bad argument.
I think I don't want to leave Hitler as atheist on the table because it's worth remembering that his whole project, this whole fantasy of the 1,000-year Reich, is shot through with certainty. It's shot through with a kind of supernatural arrogance. It doesn't have anything to do with the Enlightenment, which gives us these great gifts, not only of reason and arguably atheism, but also doubt. I think atheism is about skepticism, and Hitler was probably the least skeptical person who ever lived. And it's also always worth remembering that, the evil seeds of Nazism fell on soil made very fertile by 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. So you cannot equate the absolute certainty, the absolute disinterest in any sort of post-Enlightenment conversation among the architects of the Third Reich. You cannot say that's continuous with atheism. It's continuous with its opposite.
It's ridiculous to say that, he created an atheist sort of society when people marched into battle with the words like "God is with us" on their belt buckles. It's, like I'm trying to think of how many atheists put that on their belt buckles, like it's a very common thing to do to sort of, it's a piece of rhetoric, and it's used by, some believers to sort of, cloud the minds of other people, and it's an easy way to whip up hatred, and it's cheap. And I really expect more of thinkers.
I think we also are probably tired of hearing the argument that faith is its own sort of, or that atheism rather is its own sort of faith. It's a position that I don't want to pick on Orson Scott Card anymore today, because we hear this from lots of people.
Sure.
Lots of people. Oh, you atheists, you have your own church. Well, no, that's an irrational position to take. It can't be supported philosophically. A reasoned decision not to buy into somebody else's revelation is not itself a revelation. You don't need the clouds to part and an angel to blow a trumpet in your ear before you decide that God is a hoax, or astrology is bankrupt, or Ouija boards are malarkey. You just don't need that. And it's disingenuous, as you said, Toby, to reason that way.
Okay, I mean, so Jim, you mentioned that that science fiction is this sort of very hospitable place for science, and inhospitable in a way for religion. But you are classified as a science fiction author, and that's where your books appear, but they're just bursting with religious characters and images and things. Why do you think that the sort of science fiction publishing world has become such a good home for you to explore all these religious ideas?
Well, when you join the science fiction community, you're handed this wonderful toolkit. And it's full of robots and time machines and alternative realities. So I would say, well, maybe I don't exactly write science fiction, but I certainly use those tools to perform the theological experiments, the theological thought experiments that so fascinate me. And I certainly wouldn't want to be shelved in the religious section of a bookstore. I usually run screaming from that quadrant of Barnes and Noble. Science fiction just invites you to have the broadest possible perspective on the mystery of it all. We're thrown into the world, as Heidegger says. Well, Heidegger's Nazism, that's another day's discussion. but I always love that image from Heidegger. We're thrown here. We don't know what we're doing here, but I think it behooves us in our bewilderment to try to ask really good questions and to be as curious as we possibly can. And the critique, one of the many critiques I have of religion, is it seems to shut down curiosity, and it invites us to settle for very bad answers to those to those fundamental mysteries. So I just see it as this wonderful mad scientist laboratory, the SF genre. Sure, I suppose I'm foreclosing on a larger readership by getting identified as a genre author, and a number of my books have been published as mainstream, but they've always depended on enthusiasm from the science fiction community to turn a profit.
Was there some, Jim? Was there some inciting incident or that caused you to start writing? Say, I think Only Begotten Daughter was maybe the first of the really explicitly religious books. How did that come about? And
I would trace it to the feminist movement of the early 70s. I just woke up one day and said, it's a big problem that all of the major monotheistic religions, they rank order the genders, right? They rank order them, and men win. And as that old Yiddish proverb goes, the most a woman can hope for is to be her husband's footstool in heaven. And I said, wow, what if there was a female Jesus? What if there was a second coming, but with the gender expectation flipped? And so Only Begotten Daughter becomes the saga of Julie Katz, whose problems include the fact that she's Jesus Christ's divine half-sister, but as a deity marooned in the 20th century, when the Christian consensus has been lost, she doesn't have an agenda. But I just wanted to get away from that. All the Hebrew prophets are guys, and God is a guy, and Jesus is a guy, and the Virgin Mary is a big problem when you consider what a schizoid role model that is for women. You're supposed to be a mother, and you're also supposed to be a virgin. So I thought there was a lot to do with that zone, and God knows there still is work to do with the whole feminist insight. I often I find it very reliable to ask the question when we want to know how moral a behavior is, how moral a society is, how moral a particular strain of faith is. The question to ask is, how does it treat women?
And I mean, you mentioned earlier, Jim, the sort of rise of organized secularism and the new atheists and stuff. Have you witnessed any sort of shift in how your books are received in the broader culture as a result of that kind of that sort of shift?
I'm getting some traction in the outside world. I'm just back from the first conference ever, sponsored by the International Society for Heresy Studies, of which I was a founder, along with Bernard Schweitzer and of Long Island University, and Greg Erickson of NYU, Rebecca Goldstein, the wonderful philosopher novelist, James Wood, the celebrated book critic, and the International Society for Heresy Studies is at one level not a riposte to the new atheists, but an argument that these theological questions are so complex, we must not dismiss churches with sneering. On the other hand, we must not defer to religion. And there has been, I think, maybe until secular humanism got this kind of present traction, there's a tendency to always strain literature through confession, through faith. Dostoevsky was such a pious man. Well, no, he wasn't. He was racked by doubt. And he gives us that amazing character of Ivan Karamazov, who, when Ivan Karamazov is on stage, is speaking for Dostoevsky, as far as I'm concerned. That's what that novel is, such a marvelous thought experiment. Melville, while not absolutely an atheist, famously writes to Nathaniel Hawthorne, his good friend, after Melville finishes penning Moby Dick. He tells Hawthorne, "I've written a wicked book and feel spotless as the lamb." And Moby Dick is clearly about a person, an Ahab, a Job figure who has this quarrel with God, who will not accept the cosmic status quo. But that's rarely that's rarely celebrated in Melville criticism. So that's why us heretics have gotten together. And we're now going to have our own journal and our own newsletter and more conferences, I hope.
Mm. And so, Toby, how have you, have you been sort of what's been your take on the whole rise of organized secularism and the new atheists and stuff? Did you follow it much? Were you excited about it? Were you skeptical of it? What do you think?
I'm happy to come on and talk about the atheism that I share it, but I actually really don't spend a lot of time reading these guys or thinking about it. I do feel that I would like to see more protection or less sort of less antagonism towards atheism in general society, and so I will always sort of speak up and make sure that people know I am one. In the belief that I should be upfront about my beliefs, so that people know that I am not just automatically whatever they are. So that assumption of that assumption that everyone is of one particular mindset cannot just sort of railroad you. And I have not followed them that closely. For a while there, when I'd gotten out of college, I live in a red county, which is very religious, and went to a very religious small college. And I think when I came out for like a year or two, I was still kind of bouncing off of everyone. And so I followed a lot of blogs and read a lot of books about what was happening in that area. But I kind of tuned out of that because I kind of want to push back a little bit against something Jim actually said, which was that you felt that science fiction is in some ways hostile to religious thought. And I think what attracts me to atheism and the genre I work in is not so much a hostility, because I think that buys into the message that some religious people are trying to sell, that an absence of religion is hostile. And I think that what appeals to me about pushing back a little bit to gain some space in society to be atheist and about science fiction is that it's secular, which does not mean anti-religious. Secular just means, finding the common ground between lots of different kinds of religions and people with no religion, and creating a structure in which we can all sort of be harmonious and focus on what the Buddhists say, the truth that is there, if you just dig and dig and dig, whether or not you believe in it or not, and to find that together, no matter what you believe, is what interests me. And if that sounds a little hippie, that's me. But
and to be sure, there is such science fiction puts such a premium on what we've been calling since time immemorial the sense of wonder, which is certainly not discontinuous with the religious impulse. And your word secular, Toby, is a very good one. And to go back to Hitler, I think the last way that we have any right to characterize the Third Reich is to say that it was secular. It was nothing of the kind. It was shot through with irrationalist beliefs, even if they weren't explicitly monotheistic.
But so Toby, you mentioned that actually that a lot of your readers don't know your feelings about religion at all, which I suspect is not true of many of Jim's readers, right?
That's a safe.
Do you is that a conscious decision on your part, or just what role do you think that your non-belief plays in your fiction, or how does it come through or not in your fiction?
It's definitely there in my fiction. I don't spend a ton of time on reacting, tussling, but there are lots of things that you'll find that I'm trying to interact with. I think it comes out of that belief I have that I was mentioning, that it's not something I actually spend a lot of my daily mental effort on. It was something I noticed when I was trying to explain it. I have a really good friend in town who's literally a seventh-day creationist. He believes the Earth was formed 3,000 years ago or what have you. And he and I sometimes have interesting lunches together. And when we were first working together and getting to know each other, he had a lot of questions for me. And I was trying to explain to him that sometimes he would ask me a question, which was just sort of the thing where I was like, I'll have to think about that and get back to you. And he's like, well, why don't you know this? And I'd say, It'd be like me asking you, like, what do you think of Hera's relationship with Zeus and the, number of gods that they produced, demigods? It's like, I'll have to get back to you on that. I haven't thought through that. I don't have any feelings on that thing that you just asked me, because I don't sit around and think about this. When I created a secular sort of mental space for myself, a lot of that stuff, just sort of is not on the table for you to spend a lot of time thinking. So as a result, I think you can see, if you read through my blog entries back in, the early 2000s, you can see a little bit more with me tussling with larger society and talking about atheism and talking about my, lack of belief and what it's like to be kind of a modern day non-believer, where, people still say things like, they would trust, anyone other than an atheist in Pew surveys, and they think an atheist would be the least trustworthy person to become a politician, and so forth and so on. And you sort of like, encounter these little moments in daily life where people will say things around you, and you suddenly realize that, like, oh, wow, everyone thinks that people who are like me are monsters and baby killers. And and you have to pick and choose whether you're going to stand up and have this miniature battle, or whether, you just STFU and move on. And, in the 2000s, I had a lot more energy to throw at just tussling with people who said things that I found extremely dubious. Now I still point them out, but I'm not, it just hasn't come up as much because I don't know, maybe society has changed a little bit more in the last 10 years. Maybe, people are fighting on other levels, and maybe the new atheism has gotten a little bit more attention to the arguments out there, so that the arguments that really bothered me are no longer being tussled out as much. Or, maybe there's a cognitive bubble I've been living in where I've just kind of like stopped reading certain things, and so I'm not getting mad about them. I'm not really sure what happened there.
I'd have to say, not all of my readers assume that I'm atheist. And by the way, I don't love the word atheist, because it only points to a void. And that's why I prefer humanist, secularist, whatever. But
Yeah.
many of them find, because I take theology so seriously and I take people of faith so seriously, they find a kind of faith, or at least quasi-religious affirmation, in my books. And that's fine with me. When I receive an email from a believer saying, Jim, I'm really grateful. You helped me to not take religion so damn seriously. I'm very gratified. I mean, I love getting emails from atheists saying, go for it, Jim. Give the dead carcass of religion one more kick in the groin for me. But I'm much more interested in the conversation, a grand post-Enlightenment conversation. And that includes believers and non-believers and bewildered pilgrims, which is how I sometimes describe myself. There's a character, a minor character in my novel, Towing Jehovah, who is a Jewish. I think his name is Neil Weisinger. He's an able-bodied seaman, and he has beliefs that come out of Jewish mysticism. This idea of the Ein Sof, sort of the unknowable essence of God. He calls this unknowable essence the God of the 4 a.m. watch, when you're on the foredeck of a super tanker and there's this canopy of stars and you're in a timeless, almost spaceless zone. And people will come up to me and say, are you making fun of this? Are you mocking the character of Neil Weisinger? And I say, no, not at all. He's speaking for himself. And at that moment, I'm trying to be him. The challenge for me is to create characters of faith who are credible, who are sympathetic, who are to some degree me. The satiric stuff comes naturally, but creating believers is the challenge, and it's a challenge I relish.
Well, it's a challenge many religious people actually don't even face in their fiction, There tends to be sometimes a secular by default. The sort of, if I don't touch that live wire, even if it is something I share, then I don't have to get it wrong.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think it's interesting to see Jem, some of the reviews and articles that respond to your work from people who are believers, because I think in some ways, your work generates more of an interesting conversation for believers than some of the stuff that is written by people who already believe.
Yeah, and I think as I often say, God put me here to argue against His existence, and I think many of my church-going readers are sort of responding to that paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And if we must use the word atheism, and it's sometimes an extremely useful word, I like to think that it's as inclusive as any other worldview. Who said nothing human is alien to me? Anyway, it's a great line, and that's how I feel.
Okay, so Jim, I mean, you mentioned Towing Jehovah, and I really want to ask you about the sequel, Blameless and Abandoned.
Yeah.
Which they take the body of God that had died in the previous novel and put it on trial. And there's this whole trial about, can you justify the ways of God to man? And it goes through all the classic arguments like that. And one of the criticisms of the new atheists, this came up in the interview with Lawrence Krauss a little bit, is that they don't know enough theology. But I've watched years worth of these debates, and it's been seriously 7 years since I heard a new argument. But if I ever mention this, people are like, oh no, you have to read this theologian, this theologian, this theologian. And I'm just suspicious that they're not going to say anything new. And I just wonder, you wrote a whole book about these kinds of things. Like, do you think that there are arguments, like really good arguments, to justify either the existence of God or the morality of God out there that you haven't heard yet? Or is it all just, it's all beating a dead horse, as you said?
Well, I think the problem of evil is the greatest stumbling block to faith. I'd have to say, when I started researching Blameless and Abandoned, which is kind of a modern dress retelling of Job, and God is put on trial by this man who has endured horrible and unjust suffering. When I embarked on the project, I said, well, it'll be easy to make the case for the prosecution. A couple of kids with leukemia ought to do that. And then when I got into the theology, I discovered there are entire shelves in serious libraries by Christian writers, by writers of faith, grappling with the problem of evil. Christianity, to its credit, has taken the problem of pain very seriously. Not the Christian who wrote the book called The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis, who, for my money, utterly trivializes human suffering, in the name of redeeming God, anything to protect that bastard reputation, anything to enlist our allegiance to the divine. No, I'm sorry. Actually, I owe a kind of debt to The Problem of Pain, because my anger at that book, the way it trivializes human suffering, kept me going, kept me returning to the word processor day in, day out. So, I think the arguments that try to use your phrase, Dave, justify the ways of God to man, all fail.
To be fair, I didn't actually come up with that phrase.
Yeah. I think the five great theodicies, the free will defense and the ontological defense and the disciplinary defense and the eschatological defense and the hidden harmony defense, they all fail, and it's fascinating to me why they fail. I should also mention a book by Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, who was there at the foundation of this International Society for Heresy Studies. Her recent novel called 36 Arguments for the Existence of God is, in fact, nothing of the kind. It's
sneaky.
Going beyond evil, the problem of evil, the whole problem of does God exist or not, is addressed in this marvelous appendix, allegedly written by the protagonist of Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein's novel. It's about a character named Cass Seltzer, who is perhaps vaguely based on Sam Harris, but it's not a Roman Clay. He's called the atheist with a soul, and he's become a media celebrity for being able to make arguments that, using the tools of analytic philosophy, refute all the traditional all 36 of the classical proofs of God. So it's a tour de force. Read the book for the delight of the story, but don't skip the appendix. It's just brilliant.
Well, so Jim, do you want to tell us about your new book, The Madonna and the Starship, which in a lot of ways seems almost like a parody or a critique of the New Atheists? I don't know if that's how it's intended, but
yeah, it's another James Morrow thought experiment. A little hard to summarize. It's wall to wall plotting, but the the main character is a science fiction pulp writer named Kurt Jastrow, who plays an eccentric tinkerer on a children's program called Uncle Wonder's Attic. He's doing science experiments for kids. Character is clearly based on Don Herbert of Watch Mr. Wizard fame. So one day, a couple of sentient lobsters from planet Qualamoso show up to give Kurt, my hero, an award for his contribution to keeping the light of reason burning throughout the Milky Way. So they are logical positivists from outer space. And their world is extremely anti-metaphysical. So after they give Kurt the award, they go to leave the NBC studio. This all takes place in 1953 during the age of live television. The lobsters catch a rehearsal for a religious program called Not by Bread Alone. They're horrified, of course. This is Friday afternoon when they see the rehearsal. The show is going to be broadcast on Sunday. So Kurt has just 40 hours to try to convince the lobsters that Not by Bread Alone is really a satiric program that mocks religion. Because if he doesn't do this, the aliens will retrofit a death ray onto the carrier wave of Not by Bread Alone and zap all of the millions of viewers of the show. So the only way that Kurt can do this is to write and produce a new teleplay and make that the Sunday morning broadcast, and the lobsters, the aliens watching this, will see, oh yes, Earth is actually a completely secular planet. So am I mocking the New Atheist? Hadn't thought about that. I guess I'm acknowledging that there is maybe a kind of atheism that could degenerate into nihilism. There is, to be sure, many strains, for my money, almost all strains of religion also have that potential. But it was fun to kind of argue against my own worldview up to a point. But it develops that these logical positivists from outer space, these anti-metaphysical lobsters, really don't take the doubt part seriously. They don't take the skepticism part seriously, and that's why they're prepared to kill 2 million TV viewers come Sunday morning. So I guess I like the fact that my atheist hero intuitively says, well, I must do everything in my power to protect these believers, because, as Toby was saying earlier, atheists are so often thought of as immoral people. Unless we have a moral compass handed down by God, we're prepared to commit mass murder. I think Ivan Karamazov gets it exactly wrong. The famous line in Dostoevsky's novel where Ivan says, well, without God, everything is permitted. Seems to me that we have a large and bloody body of evidence suggesting something like the opposite, that with God, everything is permitted. That if God tells you to start a crusade, or that it's okay to drive the getaway car for a pedophile priest, well, then the conversation's over. That settles it. That's a big problem.
All right, so we're starting to run up on time here. Toby, do you have any other works of yours that deal with atheism or religion or anything that you want to point people to?
I'm always playing with. I think if you read my Caribbean space operas like Crystal Rain, Ragamuffin, and Sly Mongoose, one of the things I do in them is I have a sort of artificial religion made by aliens that's believed by people. And they take it very seriously, particularly since the aliens who claim they're gods are manifest and visible, which is sort of always a compelling argument. And one of the things that I've never seen a reviewer kind of pick up on is that I kind of mature the religion over the books. So in the first book, it is a new and very bloody religion that people follow quite literally. And come Ragamuffin, the vestiges of that and the reactions to it are kind of being sorted up. And by Sly Mongoose, which comes along much later, you can see that this religion has kind of become an older religion that people follow, but it is figured out how to compensate for the early bloodiness. And that sort of the evolution of religion always kind of fascinates me, the way some religions can kind of mature into a way in which they can allow a cosmopolitan, group of people to live within them and people of different beliefs to interact with it without kind of being convulsively militaristic. And there's just a little bit of that if people are paying attention. The big thing I'm working on right now is I'm trying to write a couple of sort of techno thriller like novels about global warming, and that's that actually does get to the heart of some of what I was talking about in terms of secularism and openness to science. Because writing these novels actually exposes me to a great deal of right-wing religious lashback, because the sort of state religion weird, conservatism plus evangelicalism have kind of, wrapped around each other into this thing that convinces people that if they're evangelical and right-wing, that they also are, basically against science right now in terms of, the realization about global warming and its impending problems. So right now I'm engaged in sort of a dialogue where a lot of people are very angry with me for trying to write a novel that kind of, game plays out what it'll look like when the Arctic Circle is done melting, which it's in the process of.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, we have this terrifying phenomenon of members of Congress saying, like, there's no global warming because God promised in the Bible not to flood the earth again. So, case closed.
There you go. Case closed. And that gets back to what Jim was saying, which is that there's this entirely scary lack of engagement with people who just use God says, right? Like what you cannot have a sort of functioning society that grapples with science and that grapples with any rational stuff when you have a large number of people that just sort of go, God said. It's really tough to kind of figure out what the consensual reality is when you have that. And so right now we have a number of people who actually are just straight up denying, what looks like a very, very solid consensus reality. I've done a couple talks and stuff. I remember talking to some students where one of them says, like, I just don't believe it. And it's sort of, it's really tough to get around that, where someone just says, I don't believe it. You can't say, like, here are some charts and here's the science and here's what we see happening. And here are pictures from 50 years ago that show massive glaciers here. And here are pictures from today that show none. And they say that isn't happening. I don't believe it. Right. And then you go like, well, I'm actually having a problem here. I don't know what to say to you. It's really, really tough to talk.
So when people post, these angry people you mentioned on the internet, maybe they email you, do you try to respond to those, or do you just sort of say it's not even, there's no point?
I'll give one go around, because usually a lot of people will send the same links and the same arguments. As you were saying, no new argument under the sun. It becomes very boringly similar. So I do have like a basic template for returning basic inquiries, because sometimes you can tell people that, like, hey, you're using really bad data. This is made up stuff. Scientists actually don't believe that. Here's a look at, here's a PLOS query. You can go run and look up the academic articles. And sometimes, maybe I'm not going to say that I refuse to dialogue with people, because that's not really helpful. Saying that it does get tiring is because I'm not a climate science expert. I'm an author. I did a lot of research, but I have a notoriously sieve-like mind, and I'm, just as you noticed from bringing up a blog entry from 12 years ago. And I was like, that sounds wonderful. I'm glad I said those things. Go me. Yeah, things are falling out of my head as fast as I can put them in there. So it is really tough to kind of, get into a knockout, drag down argument with someone about this, because it's like I have other things to write and I only have so many hours a day. But I do try to engage and honestly engage from a position of seeking to find out why someone believes this thing. And, if it's someone who has bad information and stuff like that, we can go around and I can give them some sites and say, go poke around. But if it's someone who just sort of throws up their hand and says, it can't be real because I'm religious, that is so dangerous, I think. And it's so perplexing.
God is such a trump card, or kind of a Trump sledgehammer. And yeah, now suddenly with global warming, the stakes are really high. And, I salute you, Toby, for fighting the good fight. We have to try to drag these people into the open-ended post-Enlightenment conversation, in which scientific knowledge, to be sure, is provisional, but it's also progressive. And if you don't believe in progressive knowledge, you're missing out on being fully alive.
Okay, so Jim, I mean, I feel like we can't talk about climate change without also talking about evolution. And I know for a long time you've been working on this Darwin book. It seems like many of your books take a really long time to come out. I don't know to what extent that has to do with their controversial nature or not. But what's this? Tell us about the Darwin book and what's the story with that?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of a perfectionist, for better or worse. So my relatively unprolific output is a function of my being my own worst enemy. But yeah, the last couple of my most recent novels were difficult to sell, and I don't know if it's because of their intensely skeptical content. That's maybe another day's discussion. But On the Runway, due to appear in January, is my novel about the coming of the Darwinian worldview, an historical novel. It's called Galapagos Regained, and it's all about Charles Darwin's zookeeper, a fictional character named Chloe Bathurst, who's in charge of live specimens that Darwin brought back from his world travels, from the Galapagos archipelago in particular, giant tortoises and exotic birds and marine iguanas. Now, to be sure, Darwin didn't really bring a menagerie back, but the fine print in my poetic license lets me imagine that. So at one point, Chloe, the zookeeper, gets wind of something called the Great God Contest, sponsored by the Percy Bysshe Shelley Society. £10,000 to the first philosopher or theologian or scientist or sage who can prove or disprove the existence of God. Chloe, hanging out with Darwin and his colleagues, has gotten a sense that the theory of evolution by natural selection is at base an atheist argument. So she thinks she can win the gold by appearing before the judges in Oxford. When she tells Darwin she would love to enter the contest, can I please borrow these illustrative specimens? Can I have a couple of giant tortoises and some of these birds over here and a few marine iguanas? He's horrified. He thinks this is a very tawdry contest. It's a scandal, in fact. So Chloe has to take matters into her own hands and recapitulate Darwin's voyage in an attempt to round up the same live, very vivid, and from her point of view, very persuasive illustrations. So it's a kind of epic that maybe nods to Voltaire's Candide and Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. And I won't tell you how it all plays out. The other thing I've been getting into is blogging, especially about this sort of spate of journeys, the genre of journeys to heaven. About a year ago, I spoke my mind about the book called Heaven is for Real by Todd Burpo, whose son, Colton, apparently had a near-death experience from peritonitis and went to heaven and was dandled on Jesus's knee. More recently, and I haven't written this essay yet, we have Dr. Eben Alexander's book called Proof of heaven. And what bewilders me about both those books is the failure of the authors to ask what I think of as fundamental questions. Most especially, well, how does God feel about the fact that his cover has been blown? How does he feel about this unequivocal proof? Because there's not one syllable of doubt in either Heaven is for Real by Burpo or Proof of Heaven by Alexander. Here God has been messing with our heads for thousands and thousands of years. He's been hiding himself, declining to answer our prayers, at least hasn't been doing so reliably, declining to intervene at Auschwitz or in the case of Hiroshima. Suddenly the game is up, and God has been unequivocally unmasked. Did he really want this to play out in that fashion? I mean, does he really want the ultimate revelation to take the form of a New York Times bestseller? That seems preposterous to me.
I have to say, Jim, I loved your line. It was something like the dad isn't surprised at all when his kid tells him that St. Paul was wrong and Family Circus was right.
Yeah. He doesn't seem to have taken any notice of the fact that his kid, went to heaven as a Methodist and came back a heretic, both vis-a-vis St. Paul and then just the whole argument, the whole Trinitarian argument that God and the Son and the ghosts are all of the same substance, as opposed to the Arian heresy that has Jesus being a kind of secondary divinity, not wholly commensurate with God. And yet there's all of these snapshots in Heaven is for Real of God and Jesus, in which Jesus seems to be playing a subordinate role. It doesn't make any theological sense unless the kid has become a heretic. So anyway, the other thing that so bewilders me about this genre, and I think they sort of map onto alien abduction stories. In other words, not a single shred of substantive corroboration. And that if only one of these people would return from heaven with a mathematical proof. I mean, for heaven's sakes, Eben Alexander saw the face of God. Could he exit with maybe a beautiful sonnet in his head now? Or something that isn't this new age boilerplate that he lays on us in the second half of the book. For me, it's ultimately a very nihilistic view. Alexander talks about how everything that we think of as the physical world, the given universe, that's just a speck of dust. That's his metaphor. It's just a grain of sand. All of human achievement, all of human suffering, a speck of dust. What a nihilistic view that is, ultimately. So I don't think that's how the author constructs it.
All right, we should probably start wrapping this up. But Jim, if people want to read some of these blog posts you're talking about, how do they find you online? Where should they go?
Well, if you just Google The Passionate Rationalist, that's the name of my blog, and I think it's the first hit you get. And yeah, you can read my deconstruction of Heaven is for Real and some of my unhappy thoughts about a public intellectual named Chris Hedges and his critique of the new atheists, and then I will attempt to set the world straight about the book called Proof of Heaven in the next month or so.
All right, great. Yeah, no, I would just strongly encourage all our listeners to go check out Jim's books. He's one of my favorite contemporary writers, and I've always thought that my ideal society would be one where I would just see everyone reading James Morrow books on the subway. So hopefully,
I'd have to confess that's not too far from my ideal either.
And Toby, why don't you, you mentioned Hurricane Fever. Why don't you just tell us a little bit more about the plot and just any other projects you want to let people know about?
Sure. Hurricane Fever is a follow-up to Arctic Rising, but it stands on its own. It's a story of Prudence Jones, a Caribbean spy who's yanked out of retirement when when the teenager he's taking care of is killed in St. Thomas, and a dead friend of his kind of asks him for a favor through a voicemail. So it's set in the Caribbean. There's a lot of sort of James Bond-esque escapades, and it's deals with the sort of the heavy weather and lots of explosions and high action, as is my wont. You can find out more, of course, at www.tobiasbuckell.com. I have all sorts of. I'm well linked up so that you can find first chapters, free chapters, and all that good stuff for all the books.
All right, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Jim, thanks for joining us.
Well, you're very welcome. This was a lot of fun.
And Toby, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show, always.
And that was our panel. Hope you enjoyed it. For more interviews and panels, visit us at geeksguideshow.com. Thanks.